Hello everyone, welcome to the session. Today we're going to be talking about Cruz Operations Center and specifically configuration management within the software tool. So the configuration management dashboard can be found off the configuration management tab, as you see highlighted here in black. And this panel here is basically going to show all of your infrastructure on the managed resources, and you'll have the ability here to back up and restore configuration files as well as deploy firmware. So the intent of this video is to show you at a high level how we can do that. So once your devices are discovered, you automatically have command line interface to your devices. That allows us to do backup and restore. If you don't have command line interface, you're not going to be able to back up your device or restore it or deploy firmware. So those are things like telnet and SSH command line that you need to access to that equipment. You'll see how that works as we move through the demo. So what you can do here is you can quickly come out here and find a device. You can easily search for things simply by putting in a partial full name of your device. But any device, whether it's an iDRAC for maybe a SCP file or a switch, you can easily back them up simply by going to a right-click option, doing file management, and backing it up. That dialog will look something similar to this, where you have various options. We're not going to go too much detail in these options other than I recommend you keep the default protocol. You can do things like adding email and even adding these to a labeled config, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what you can also do here is add other equipment, or you can add groups of equipment. So if you want to back up a whole group of devices, maybe they're all the same, or they don't have to be the same. They can be, different types of equipment. You simply add the groups that they're a part of, or add the specific equipment. You'll simply be provided with a list here of things that you want to back up here, or add the group of equipment that you want to use for your particular backup. Once you've established what you're backing up here, depending on the devices in your group, you may need to set driver-specific options. If you don't have a group in here, then you won't have a lot of these options, because when you have a group, you don't necessarily know what's in it necessarily. But if you have specific devices, the list of driver options will vary. For Dell, for example, you can back up running config or startup. Those kind of things, or even on iOS, you have slightly different options here. So set your options and then simply schedule it or execute it, and it's going to go do that backup for you. For the sake of time here, I went ahead and backed one up and just wanted to show you what a successful log looks like. So as you back these up, if you're looking at the screen and doing it manually, you'll get a similar output, various levels of information here. And if it's successful, you'll see success down here in the middle here with the green check mark. In this case, this file was already in inventory and nothing had changed, so it decided not to back it up. Now there's ways to make it back up things, but that even though they're the same, but generally that's not useful. The idea is you want to keep unique files in the repository here. But the point here is that you can hover over these devices and click on them, and you can see the actual command that it's sending to the device. So here's the actual command that occurs when we ask a device to back up. We say copy, running, and this happens to be a secure copy. It's basically from this particular file server, telling the device to copy to this file server, and we're going to use this file name. Now this isn't really relevant because the files are saved in your configuration files in the database. It becomes relevant when you want to troubleshoot. So if something fails, you might want to go and cut this command out, log in right to the command line of the device that's failing, and see if you can issue this command manually. That's going to give you a lot of information, even if you can get to the file server. So sometimes there's issues getting to that file server or other problems, and if you can't back it up from the command line of the device, then it may not be the software, it may be something else going on in your network. Okay, and where I got this from was from this the My Alerts here down at the bottom. Anything you do manually through the UI is going to show up in My History. If you want to see the same thing for any action that happens in the system, we would go to Settings Audit, and we would be able to find that same job as it was running. So here I'm back here. I searched for other devices here in my system. So what you can see here is that I have various config files that are backed up already, and this is where you'll see them. And there's audit, there's DAP, database aging policies behind these, depending on how much you want to save, how often. That's a separate topic. We'll talk about that when we get to the control panel options. But what you can do if you want to restore, typically you want to come in, you might want to just restore on demand. You can simply just click restore. You'll get a similar dialog as we saw before. You simply click execute, and it will restore that config file out to that device. You can update the driver options if you want to, depending on what you need here, but you can simply execute it or schedule it, and it will restore that. You can also edit these files very easily. Just come in and say edit, and then provide some value change in here, maybe for your new config file. I'm just going to throw a piece of data in here, not there. Let's go over here, Mason. We want VLAN 308 instead of 38. We can save that. What you'll see is a brand new version created here. And you can also, all of these portlets, you can sort by date here to see what the latest one is. But you can simply come over here and then simply say restore on that one if you need to. So it's a nice way to push things out through that method. When you back up, you also do have that option to back up to a label. And so when I showed you that before here, we'll go to File Management and do a backup. There's this option in here to use that labeling. And so this labeling allows you to basically back up all of your devices, many different types of devices, and call it like a baseline or a gold configuration. And so each device will get their own independent configuration, but then they'll also have this label attached. And this comes in handy when you want to restore. You may want to go out and do a restore here, and maybe you need to restore to a baseline. To that baseline config, you can simply select the device that you're going to restore to, and then select the label here, and then pick the label off of your list of labels, and simply execute that. So the nice thing here is you can add many different pieces of devices, many different pieces of equipment, and provide that same label for all of them. If they have that label, they'll be offered up here, and then you can just basically select what label you want to go out there, and then push that out that way simply through executing or scheduling that restore of a config file. You can also create templates from your config files. That's probably a deeper discussion we won't go into. A simple right click here and a promote will capture that entire config file, put it into a templatized format, and allow you to push that template to many different devices if you need to. There's a couple of ways to do templates. That is a deeper discussion here. And here's how you can assign labels to after if you need to assign it after you've backed it up. And here's where you control the aging policies for how to retain your configuration files. Next big topic is the image repository, or the ability to deploy firmware. And so down here below is where all those images are kept. We can do basically any image for any target device here, including BIOS for iDRAC, BIOS for clients. They can be switch firmware. Generally, we seed all of the Dell firmware out of the box for the OS 6. Other ones you may need to pull in. To pull in new firmware, simply go to right-click New and select firmware images and pull that off your hard drive. We also have a way for you to get right to the Dell site where you can go to add for Dell DNOS. This will take you to a Dell page where it allows you to put in a service tag or a model, and you can find the firmware you want to pull in. This won't pull it in directly. It will put it on your hard drive though when you download it off the website. Then you would have to go through that second step of saying new firmware image and pulling that in. You simply come in here, provide a name for your firmware image, a description, whatever that could be, some numbering of the version, and simply select what you want. And in the case of, for example, an OS 10 image you want to pull in, you would simply pick that here, and then just simply go to image files and import that from disk. So that's off of your hard drive. Could do URL as well if you have access to a URL to download that. But simply select the file, it will import, and it will be available for you. And as I mentioned, just simply right click and deploy is similar to the way you do restore. You just basically from here you can select the firmware, you can add specific equipment. This happens to be an N11. I can pick many different equipment in here if I want to. I can even pick groups again, just like I did with the other one, with the restore or the backup, depending on what I need to do. But you're going to get a green validation bar letting you know if everything in that group or if that individual device is valid with that green bar. If it's not valid, simply take it off your list here, and then simply execute it manually or through a schedule. And of course, you'll have options to do various things depending on the firmware. And in this case, you can say update the boot code after the firmware is upgraded. On the server side, talking about BMC or iDRAC kind of thing, as I mentioned, you can also do these as well in terms of getting a file backed up over here. And so you can come over here and see your backed up files here. You have some more options when you're backing these up. You can go over here and say File Management Backup. And when you're backing up an iDRAC, you have other options. Even the format you want to back it up in. Sometimes JSON is more readable than XML or vice versa, depending on what you need. Various options here around those files and what to do when we export that, if we need to export it. And then you also have a choice of doing specific sections like BIOS, the BIOS section, the iDRAC section, the NIC section, the RAID section. So this is particularly useful if you want to create a template for BIOS, and maybe you want to push that out to many different devices, and that way you back up the BIOS, make it into a template, and then you'd have that configuration set up. You can restore to those as well, just to BIOS, just to iDRAC, just to NIC, or just to RAID. So just keep that in mind here. And then, of course, to deploy BIOS, you simply have that on your hard drive here. It's the same process where you just simply right-click and say deploy, and it'll deploy that firmware to the targets, the individual targets or the groups that you select. One more thing I forgot to mention on the configuration files. Just find one of those devices that has multiple files on it. that might have differences on them. So here's an in-series device. Now you might have differences between your files. You can easily come in and manually select for comparison. I don't know if I have differences here, but we'll find out. There we go. So we have some differences between these two versions. Normally you'll see the versions up here at the top. This ProScan config is more related to our compliance policies. If we detect a changed config, we'll back them up to our ProScan type. So you're not isolated to just comparing configs against similar devices or the same device. You can compare against any device. So you'll notice here, all of these portlets have a little plus sign in the upper right, and they can all be expanded in this way. So I'm going to click on the configuration files, and I'm going to expand that, giving us a larger view. Okay, in this view, you're going to have access to all config files. It's unfiltered out of the box. So you can basically select two devices that may be similar in some way, and compare the configs on those two devices. So here's, I got 3154 versus 3156. I can compare those here as well and see any differences. Sometimes that's useful if you need to just see, two devices that should have similar configs. One's working, one's not. Maybe you can compare the two in those kind of cases. As with all of our portlets, you can create your own filters here. So if you want to see just a specific device name or something else, you can simply select the equipment here. If you just want to see a specific IP and all of its configs here, you can do that here as well. Simply create your filter here and hit go. And if you want to save it as a persisted filter, then you can simply just save it. And once you do, then it will show up on this list here for you to easily come in here and just pick specific filters that you may have already saved or things that you want to see at a quicker glance. On the group operations side, I think I mentioned earlier, you can multi-select in here whatever you want, and you can actually do that file management activities for backup, restore, and deployment, but you can also add these to groups dynamically from here. So you can create new groups, static groups, or dynamic groups. Static group is something you explicitly set with the elements, or dynamic is something you may define as maybe between, a start IP and end IP, or a specific model, or some specific name of your devices. However you do it, that would be a dynamic group. So when it's discovered, it's automatically in that group. We leverage that in our group, in our scheduling, so that we can basically back up an entire group and not, every time you discover something, it's automatically in there. But as I mentioned, you can add those to those groups, and these groups are actually in this Manage Resources Groups portlet I show you down here at the bottom. This can be found also on the settings page. I'll scroll to the top here just to show you, but if you go to settings under groups and locations, it's also here, or you can go to add applications at the top of this software and add this to your page if you want to. But what this allows you to do is once you have a static or fixed group or a dynamic group, you can simply right click the group in general and do a backup of the entire group that way. So just a lot of ways to get at it here. Then just as in wrapping up here, you have your alarms in the middle here, which is everything related to backup, restore, and deployment. So if you're the person in charge of looking at this stuff, then this is the place you'd want to look for problems that you might be having. All of these events can be wrapped into automation rules, which is a deeper topic to email things when things happen or fail, or whatever you need there. Obviously your groups here of your schedules, you may group your devices. You may have multiple groups, depending on your maintenance windows and when you need to back up. All those groups will be stored here. Simply right click and say new to create a new group, a new backup or restore or deployment type of schedule. It's ready for you there. And then finally on the reporting side, we have some reports down here that are going to show you things like when you've changed firmware. If you've deployed, you can see what changed since some period in time. Simply right click and say execute those reports to get that information. Alternatively, you can do an advanced option for automatically having reports sent out about change reports. We also have just standard firmware reports, a variety of other different reports in here. The change configuration report was one that will tell you differences that may have been detected between two config files. And then down below here we have the file server. So we do recommend that you use an external server. Generally the Windows package comes with an internal server pre-built in. It's good for a few devices, less than 25, but if you start getting into more of a production scenario, we recommend that you create an external file server. And the file server is simply for the backup and restore options and deploy options that occur. And so you generally can create a new one. Well, essentially, you would need to have one already in your environment. One of the ways we can give you some to set those up, but basically it's a file server outside of the software that's set up to understand FTP, TFTP, and SCP. So if you have one in your environment, basically you just come over here and say new, give it a name. You decide here what you want. Generally, you can do FTP and TFTP together. If you don't want TFTP, you can uncheck that. Certainly give it a name here. But you would create a file server just for, this is less secure, FTP and TFTP. Simply give an IP address, the login to the file server, and the password. And don't worry about the external IP. That's generally for more advanced cases. But that's all you really need to have a file server that supports FTP and TFTP. If you need an additional one for secure file server, just create a new one. It could be the same one, by the way, but you would create a new one. Again, give it the same IP address, the login and password, or whatever your file server is. Now, generally, when you create these servers, the directory that it writes to, your configuration files, needs to be the same for all of these. So what happens is we tell the device to copy its configuration file to some location, and then what happens is the software goes to that file server and pulls it out of that location. So that's why it has to be the same. The way it's set up, it needs to be the same location so we know where to get it. Anyway, you might have 2 or 3 of those set up. You'll use the one that's closest to the device or most secure, so you can have multiple here. But once that's set up, you can simply right-click and you can test it and make sure it's working. And as soon as everything is good, you can simply right-click a device and do your backup, restore, and deployment. Okay, I hope that was helpful to you. Any questions, please contact us at DoradoSoftware.com.